Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases registered in the history of the United States. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this narration. We're interested to know in which places and at what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. The year was 1881. The Lincoln County War had recently ended, and the vast, unforgiving landscape of the New Mexico Territory was still reeling from years of bloodshed. The railroads had just connected this frontier to the rest of America, bringing new settlers, opportunities, and unknown dangers to these isolated lands. In the shadow of this changing world, a peculiar rancher established himself far from prying eyes, and what happened at his remote property would become one of the most macabre chapters in frontier history, one deliberately buried by those who discovered it. What follows is the tale of a man who turned the isolation of the frontier and the desperation of travelers into a horrifying enterprise. This is the forbidden macabre history of the rancher who cooked his guests alive. The territory's archives paint a fragmented picture of Theodore Blackwood, the man at the center of this grim tale. Records show he purchased a remote property in April of 1880, approximately 30 miles northeast of the small settlement of Lincoln, far from established roads and civilization. The deed, filed in the Territorial Land Office, described a 160-acre parcel with access to a natural spring, valuable real estate in the arid landscape. According to the purchase agreement, Blackwood paid in full with gold coins, raising no suspicions at the time. The ranch sat in a narrow valley surrounded by steep, rocky terrain. It was a natural corridor through an otherwise impassable stretch of land, a feature that would later prove central to Blackwood's sinister design. By autumn of 1881, the property had transformed from barren scrubland to a functioning homestead with a main house, a large barn, and several outbuildings. How Blackwood accomplished this construction so quickly and with what labor remains one of the many unanswered questions of this case. Prior to his arrival in New Mexico, Blackwood's history is murky at best. No records of his existence appear in any eastern state registries before 1878. Some speculate he may have changed his name or come from overseas, though no immigration records match his description. The only hint of his past came from a notation in the Lincoln County Sheriff's log, dated September 1880, recording a conversation with Blackwood in which he claimed to have experience as a butcher in Chicago following the Civil War. A schoolteacher from Lincoln, Margaret Winters, documented in her personal journal a brief encounter with Blackwood during one of his infrequent visits to town. Her entry from October 1880 provides one of the few physical descriptions we have. Met the new rancher today, Mr. Blackwood. A tall man, lean but strong, with peculiar eyes that seem to look through rather than at you. His hands are those of someone accustomed to labor with thick calluses and several old scars. He purchased an unusual quantity of salt and spices from the general store, explaining he preserves his own meat. There is something in his manner that inspires unease, though I cannot pinpoint why. He speaks with an accent I cannot place, not quite southern, yet not northern either. What we do know with certainty is that by the winter of 1881, travelers had begun to disappear along the routes near Blackwood's property. The stage line reported at least 3 missing persons who had disembarked at way stations, intending to traverse the territory on foot or horseback, heading in the direction of Blackwood's land. Their disappearances caused little concern at first. The harsh landscape claimed many lives, and officials attributed their vanishing to the natural dangers of the frontier. No one would discover the horrifying truth until spring of 1882, and by then the number of victims had grown far beyond what anyone could have imagined. The ranch that Theodore Blackwood constructed in that remote valley was, by all accounts, surprisingly welcoming. According to territorial postal records, Blackwood made regular trips to Lincoln for supplies, often purchasing more than seemed necessary for a single man. He explained his abundant provisions as preparation for the harsh winters and potential travelers who might need shelter. His property became known among locals as a place where weary travelers could find refuge from the elements, a hot meal, and a place to rest before continuing their journey. This reputation was deliberately cultivated, as evidenced by several advertisements Blackwood placed in the territorial newspaper offering safe harbor for those traversing the difficult terrain northeast of Lincoln. It was a reputation that would serve his dark purposes all too well. The first documented visitor to return from Blackwood's ranch was a cattle buyer named James Collins. In a letter to his wife dated November 1880, preserved in the territorial archives, Collins described the strange layout of Blackwood's property. The main house sits back against the hillside, almost merged with the rock itself. The barn is unusually large, with thick walls that Blackwood claims keep the temperatures stable. Most curious is the smokehouse, built partially into the ground with a complex chimney system that Blackwood seemed particularly proud of. I found the smell emanating from it most peculiar, not like any smoked meat I've encountered. Collins noted in his correspondence that despite Blackwood's apparent hospitality, he felt uneasy throughout his stay. He insisted I eat heartily of his stew, watching me with an intensity that bordered on inappropriate. When I declined a second helping, claiming stomach trouble, his demeanor changed noticeably. I left at first light, despite his insistence that I stay another night. Collins would be one of the few who visited the ranch and lived to share his experience. Another account comes from a land surveyor's journal. In December 1880, Edward Pierce made note of passing by Blackwood's property while mapping the region. He wrote, "Observed unusual activity at the Blackwood Ranch today. Multiple horses in the corral that did not appear to belong to a single party. No sign of their owners. When I approached to water my horse, Blackwood emerged from the barn, visibly startled by my presence. He explained the horses belonged to miners who had continued on foot to explore the nearby hills. His manner was cordial, but his eyes never matched his smile. I declined his invitation to stay the night." The surveyor's journal entry 1 week later contains a disturbing addendum. Returning past Blackwood's property today, I noticed the corral was empty. When I inquired about the miners, he claimed they had collected their horses and departed 3 days prior. I find this curious, as the only fresh tracks leading from his property were those of a single wagon, heavily laden, heading east toward the uninhabited barrens. A Mexican trader named Manuel Ortega provided another glimpse into Blackwood's operation. In a statement given to territorial authorities in April 1882, after the discovery of Blackwood's crimes, Ortega recalled, "I stopped at his ranch in January of 1881. The winter was harsh, and he offered shelter. Inside there was another guest, a young man traveling to meet family in California. Blackwood served us a stew that night. The young man ate heartily, complimenting the meat. I took only a little, as something about the smell turned my stomach. That night I heard strange sounds, like someone moving heavy objects. In the morning, the young man was gone. Blackwood said he had left before dawn. I did not believe him, but I feared to say so. I made excuse to leave quickly." Ortega admitted he had not reported his suspicions earlier because who would believe a Mexican's word against a white man's in this territory? His testimony would later corroborate key details discovered during the investigation. These accounts would later serve as crucial evidence in understanding the pattern of Blackwood's activities, but at the time, they raised no alarms. The territorial authorities were preoccupied with the aftermath of the Lincoln County War, and the disappearance of travelers in the vast expanse of the frontier was tragically commonplace. By early 1881, Blackwood had established his ranch as a waypoint known to stagecoach drivers and local traders. What no one realized was that he was systematically identifying ideal victims and refining his methods for what would become one of the most disturbing crime sprees in American history. Blackwood's isolation served as both his protection and his hunting ground. The remoteness of his property meant that travelers who stopped there were already far from help. often exhausted from their journey through difficult terrain. According to later testimony from a stagecoach driver named Malcolm Reed, Blackwood would sometimes position himself at crossroads, offering directions that conveniently led travelers to his ranch as darkness approached. Reed's account, documented in the Territorial Investigator's Notes of April 1882, stated, "He seemed to know the schedules of the coaches appearing at Holloway's Crossing whenever passengers disembarked intending to travel northeast. He would engage them in conversation, mention his ranch, and suggest it as the only safe haven before the next settlement. I thought him merely entrepreneurial, offering lodging for a fee. I had no reason to suspect anything sinister." What made Blackwood's scheme particularly effective was his ability to target those least likely to be missed immediately. According to Reed's testimony, Blackwood showed special interest in solitary travelers or those who mentioned they were starting new lives elsewhere, people whose disappearances might not raise immediate concerns. He avoided families traveling together or individuals who indicated they were expected at a specific destination by a certain date. A notation in the Lincoln County Sheriff's log from February 1881 mentions a casual conversation with Blackwood in town. Encountered T. Blackwood purchasing supplies. He inquired about recent Indian activity in the Northeast region, showing particular interest in whether patrols were regular. Explained patrols had been reduced due to peaceful conditions. He seemed pleased by this information. In retrospect, this innocent exchange revealed Blackwood's methodical assessment of risk, ensuring that his isolated property would remain free from unexpected visitors or official scrutiny. As winter descended upon the territory in 1881, the frequency of travelers passing through the region decreased, but those who did venture out were in even greater need of shelter from the harsh conditions. Blackwood's property, with its promise of warmth and food, became an irresistible lure. A merchant from Santa Fe named William Abernathy documented in his ledger a disturbing observation from January 1881. While delivering supplies to remote settlements, he noted, "Passed near Blackwood's ranch during a snowstorm, observed smoke from the chimney of what appeared to be his smokehouse, despite the severe weather conditions making smoking meat impractical. More concerning was the sound that carried on the wind, what I first took to be the howling of the storm, but which resolved into what seemed like a human cry. The snow was too deep to investigate, and I convinced myself it was merely the wind playing tricks on my cold, numbed ears." Abernathy would later question his decision not to investigate, a regret that would haunt him upon learning the truth. The most revealing pre-discovery account comes from a peddler's journal found abandoned at a camp 15 miles south of Blackwood's property. The entry, dated February 18, 1881, reads, "Staying at Blackwood's ranch tonight. Strange man, but hospitable enough. Several other guests here as well. A young couple heading to California, and a man who claims to be surveying for the railroad. Blackwood keeps to himself mostly, disappearing into the barn for hours. The cellar beneath the house is locked, which he claims is to protect his winter stores from theft. The stew he served had an unusual flavor I cannot place." The young woman barely touched hers, which seemed to irritate our host greatly. The journal contains no further entries. The peddler's wagon was discovered months later by a hunting party, hidden in a ravine 2 miles from Blackwood's property. Of the peddler himself, no trace was ever found. The journal's final entry provides a crucial insight into Blackwood's methodology, his particular attention to guests' reactions to his food. This detail would later take on horrifying significance when investigators discovered the true source of the meat he served. The young couple mentioned in the peddler's journal were later identified as Thomas and Emily Caldwell, newlyweds traveling from Missouri to seek their fortune in California. They were reported missing by Emily's parents after months without correspondence. They would become 2 of the few victims positively identified during the subsequent investigation, their personal effects discovered in a trunk hidden in Blackwood's barn. These fragments paint a picture of Blackwood's methodology, offering shelter to the vulnerable, isolating them from potential help, and then, as authorities would later discover, implementing his horrific designs upon those who were unfortunate enough to accept his hospitality. As winter gave way to spring, Blackwood's activities accelerated. What happened within the walls of his remote ranch would not be discovered until it was far too late for his many victims. The ranch itself, as described in later investigative reports, was designed with a sinister purpose disguised as frontier practicality. The main house, built partially into the hillside, contained a large kitchen with an unusual stove and oven configuration. The territorial investigator noted that Blackwood had modified standard equipment to allow for extreme heat, ostensibly for baking bread during the winter when outdoor ovens would be impractical due to heat loss. Most disturbing was the cellar, accessed through a heavy trapdoor in the kitchen floor. According to the official report filed in April 1882, the space had been divided into small compartments with iron rings embedded in the stone walls, restraints for his victims. Evidence suggested that Blackwood kept some victims alive for days or even weeks. A document found among Blackwood's possessions, described in the investigator's notes as a ledger of sorts, contained cryptic entries that appeared to track his victims. Subject 12, lean, needs tenderizing. Subject 13, good marbling, ready by week's end. The clinical detachment of these notes horrified even the hardened lawmen who discovered them. The barn, unusually large for a property with few livestock, concealed a grisly workshop. Behind a false wall, investigators discovered a room containing butchering tools, large tables with drainage channels, and various implements whose purpose could only be guessed at. The territorial surgeon, brought in to examine the evidence noted in his report, the arrangement suggests a methodical approach to human dismemberment with consideration given to blood drainage and the separation of various parts. But it was the smokehouse that revealed the full horror of Blackwood's operation. Built partially underground with a complex ventilation system, it was designed to prevent smoke from being visible at a distance while maintaining the high temperatures needed for his purposes. Inside, investigators found evidence that could not be dismissed or explained away, human remains in various stages of preservation. The territorial surgeon's report, parts of which were deemed too disturbing for the official record and sealed by judicial order, described findings that left no doubt as to the nature of Blackwood's activities. Various portions of human anatomy preserved through smoking, salting, and other methods typically used for the preservation of consumable meats. The precision of the cuts indicates knowledge of butchery techniques. Most disturbing are the signs of cooking and preparation evident on some specimens. How many travelers met their fate at Blackwood's ranch remains unknown. The territorial investigation identified at least 17 potential victims based on reported disappearances in the region between November 1880 and March 1882. But the actual number is believed to be much higher. What drove Blackwood to commit such atrocities? The question haunted investigators. No journal or personal writings were ever found to explain his motives. The only clue came from the testimony of Jeremiah Holt, a trader who had met Blackwood on several occasions in Lincoln. Holt recalled a conversation from December 1881. He spoke of his time during the war, claimed to have been at Andersonville as a prison guard, said he learned there that hunger reveals a man's true nature. I thought nothing of it at the time. Such dark talk was common among veterans, but in light of what was discovered, his words take on a more sinister meaning. Whether Blackwood's experience in the Civil War shaped his depravity or merely provided a convenient narrative for a mind already bent toward violence remains one of the many unanswered questions surrounding this case. In the main house kitchen, investigators found several handwritten recipes described in the official report as conventional in appearance but horrifying in implication given the source of the primary ingredient. These recipes, with names like Spring Stew and Hunter's Roast, suggested Blackwood approached his crimes not merely as acts of violence, but as a perverse culinary practice. Most disturbing of all was the evidence that Blackwood had not been consuming his victims alone. The dining room of the main house was set up to accommodate multiple guests, and testimony from the survivors later confirmed that he regularly served his ghastly fare to unsuspecting travelers, making them unwitting participants in cannibalism before they too became victims. What is certain is that by the spring of 1882, the remote ranch had become the site of horrors beyond imagination, and the reckoning was about to begin. The truth about Theodore Blackwood might never have come to light if not for the persistence of one man. Michael Garrett, no relation to the famous sheriff, a Boston merchant, arrived in the New Mexico Territory in March 1882, searching for his brother Thomas, who had embarked on a journey west the previous autumn, but had ceased all correspondence after indicating he would be passing through Lincoln County. Territorial records show that Garrett filed a formal inquiry with the sheriff's office in Lincoln on March 12, 1882. The sheriff, occupied with more pressing matters, offered little help beyond confirming that no one matching Thomas Garrett's description had been arrested or found dead in the county. Unsatisfied, Michael Garrett began his own investigation, retracing his brother's likely route through the territory. According to Garrett's journal, preserved in the territorial archives, he spoke with stagecoach drivers, innkeepers, and merchants throughout the region. On March 23rd, he made a crucial discovery. Driver Reed recalls my brother clearly, says he disembarked at Holloway's Crossing last November, intending to continue northeast. Reed directed him to Blackwood's Ranch as a place to seek shelter for the night. My brother never returned to the stage route. Garrett immediately sought out the sheriff with this new information. Reluctantly, the lawman agreed to accompany Garrett to Blackwood's property, bringing along 2 deputies. They arrived on the morning of March 26, 1882. What they found would shock even the most hardened frontier lawman. According to the sheriff's official report, Blackwood greeted them at the door with apparent confusion. He denied ever meeting Thomas Garrett, claiming he had hosted many travelers, but remembered no one by that name or description. When asked if they could search the property, Blackwood's demeanor reportedly changed. He attempted to flee toward the barn, but was quickly apprehended. The search that followed revealed the true nature of Blackwood's operation. In the cellar beneath the main house, they discovered 2 individuals still alive, a man named Joseph Wilson and a woman who identified herself only as Sarah. Both were emaciated, showing signs of prolonged captivity and abuse. Sarah, barely conscious, managed to whisper to Deputy Frank Miller, "He said we needed to be tenderized before we were ready." The others weren't so lucky. The sheriff's report, unusually detailed for the era, documented the methodical search of the property over the next 2 days. Evidence suggested that Blackwood had been capturing travelers for well over a year, imprisoning them in the cellar, until, for reasons known only to him, he determined they were ready. The victims were then taken to the barn, where they were killed and processed using the butcher's tools found there. Most disturbing of all was the discovery in the smokehouse and kitchen. Human remains in various stages of preparation indicated that Blackwood had not only been killing his victims, but cooking and eating them as well. The sheriff's report notes, portions of what appear to be human flesh were found preserved in salt, smoked, and in some cases prepared as food in cooking vessels. The evidence suggests Blackwood was consuming his victims and, based on the quantity discovered, potentially providing the same to unwitting guests. The implication was clear and horrifying. Blackwood had been feeding human meat to subsequent travelers who stopped at his ranch, making them unwitting cannibals before they too became victims. Michael Garrett's journal entry from March 27, 1882, reveals the personal impact of these discoveries. "I came seeking my brother, hoping against hope that he might still be found alive. What we discovered instead defies comprehension." The sheriff believes the items found in a trunk in the barn, a pocket watch, a letter from Mother, and a daguerreotype of Catherine, belonged to Thomas. I cannot bring myself to speculate on what became of him after he arrived at this place of horrors. I pray that his end was quick, though the evidence suggests otherwise. The survivors, Wilson and Sarah, provided crucial testimony about Blackwood's methods. According to Wilson's statement recorded by the territorial court clerk, he would serve stew to his guests, watching carefully as they ate. Those who commented favorably on the taste or asked for more seemed to please him greatly. He would offer them extra helpings and stronger drinks. By morning, they would be gone from the common room. We never saw them again. Sarah's testimony, though fragmented due to her weakened condition, corroborated Wilson's account and added a chilling detail. He told me once, as he brought down my daily water, that I should be grateful. Said the others had served a purpose in death that they had failed to achieve in life. Said someday I would understand the honor of becoming sustenance for the worthy. Neither survivor could provide a clear account of how many others they had seen taken away during their captivity. The true extent of Blackwood's crimes would never be fully known. Deputy Miller's personal notes, not included in the official report, but discovered among his effects after his death in 1919, describe the moment Blackwood was confronted with the evidence. When shown the contents of his smokehouse, Blackwood showed no remorse or horror. Instead, he smiled in a manner that chilled my blood and said only, "We all must eat to live." I have seen men hang for murder, seen the battlefield at Shiloh, but never have I encountered evil so pure and undiluted as in that man's eyes at that moment. News of the discoveries at Blackwood's ranch spread quickly through the territory, creating widespread panic and disbelief. The Lincoln County Herald's April 4, 1882 edition carried the headline, "Horror in the Hills, Fiend Preyed Upon Travelers," though the article contained few specific details, likely due to their disturbing nature. The territorial governor, alarmed by the potential impact on immigration and investment in the region, moved quickly to contain the situation. Blackwood was transferred under heavy guard to Santa Fe to await trial, and access to his property was strictly limited to law enforcement officials. The investigation continued under a veil of official secrecy. A memo from the governor's office to the territorial prosecutor, dated April 7, 1882, emphasized the need for discretion. The full details of this case must not become public knowledge. Such revelations would not only deter settlement and investment in the territory, but would cast a pall over the region for generations. Handle this matter with the utmost discretion. Michael Garrett, who had initiated the investigation, never found definitive proof of his brother's fate. According to his final journal entry before returning east, the sheriff believes Thomas likely stopped at Blackwood's ranch. As Reed suggested, what happened after, I cannot bring myself to contemplate too deeply. I came seeking closure, and instead found a horror beyond imagination. I leave this cursed territory with a heavier heart than when I arrived, carrying questions that perhaps are better left unanswered. The story of what happened at Blackwood's ranch in those dark months of 1881 might have faded from public memory entirely if not for what transpired next, events that would add yet another layer to the already disturbing tale. Theodore Blackwood never stood trial for his crimes. According to the warden's log from the territorial prison in Santa Fe on the night of April 17, 1882, less than 3 weeks after his arrest, Blackwood was found dead in his cell. The official cause of death was recorded as self-termination by hanging, using strips of fabric torn from his prison garments. However, rumors persisted that Blackwood's death was not a suicide. A prison guard named Enrique Salazar reportedly told a local tavern keeper that on the night of Blackwood's death, several prominent citizens of the territory had visited the prison. No official record of this visit exists. Salazar disappeared shortly after making these claims, reportedly relocating to Mexico. A letter found among the personal papers of Judge William Henderson, who would have presided over Blackwood's trial, adds credence to these rumors. Written by a territorial official whose name was redacted from the archived document, it states, "The matter has been resolved in the manner we discussed. No trial will be necessary. This approach protects the reputations of all concerned and prevents details from emerging that would only serve to damage public confidence in the administration. The swift conclusion to Blackwood's life left many questions unanswered. No confession was obtained, no explanation given for his grotesque activities. More importantly, with Blackwood's death, the full accounting of his victims would never be known. In the aftermath, territorial officials ordered Blackwood's property burned to the ground. According to the sheriff's final report, dated May 3, 1882, the main house, barn, and outbuildings have been completely destroyed by fire as directed. The cellar has been filled with stone and earth. It is our recommendation that this land never again be inhabited, as the horrors that occurred here have forever tainted this ground. A deputy present at the burning later claimed that as the flames consumed the property, sounds like screams emerged from the fire, as if the very walls held the echoes of those who had suffered there. This account was dismissed as superstition, but it contributed to the growing folklore surrounding the case. For decades, the area remained abandoned, marked on local maps simply as restricted land with no explanation. Locals avoided the region, and stories began to circulate about unusual sounds and sights near the former Blackwood property. Tales typical of a community processing collective trauma through folklore. The survivors, Joseph Wilson and Sarah, later identified as Sarah Mitchell through territorial records, provided formal testimonies which were sealed by judicial order. Wilson returned to his home in Missouri, where he lived until 1919, never publicly speaking of his ordeal. Sarah Mitchell remained in the New Mexico Territory, eventually marrying a rancher from the Pecos River Valley. According to her granddaughter's account, given to a territorial historian in 1934, Sarah never ate meat again after her rescue, nor would she allow it to be prepared in her home. In a statement made shortly before her death in 1931, Sarah Mitchell offered a final reflection on her experience. Some horrors are too great for the mind to hold. For years I could not speak of what happened in that place. Even now I find I cannot access certain memories. They are locked away in a dark corner of my mind. Perhaps this is mercy, not weakness. There are some things humans are not meant to endure or remember. The official investigation concluded in June 1882, with the territorial governor issuing a brief statement declaring the matter resolved with Blackwood's death. The case files were sealed and stored in the territorial archives, where they would remain largely untouched for nearly 80 years. What happened in that remote valley during those dark months of 1881 might have been forgotten entirely, if not for a curious historian who, in 1961, began researching disappearances along the old territorial routes. His discovery would bring the horror of Blackwood's ranch back into the light, if only briefly, before being deliberately buried once more. In October 1961, Dr. Elliot Carson, a historian researching frontier-era criminal cases at the University of New Mexico, submitted a formal request to access the sealed territorial records relating to Theodore Blackwood. After months of bureaucratic resistance, Carson was granted limited access to the files in February 1962. What he found led him to publish a small academic paper titled Predation and Cannibalism in Territorial New Mexico, The Blackwood Case. The paper, published in an obscure historical journal with limited circulation, detailed Carson's findings from the original investigation documents and included portions of survivor testimonies never before made public. According to Carson's paper, the full horror of Blackwood's operation extended beyond what had been publicly known. Evidence suggested that Blackwood had not been acting alone. Carson wrote, "Wagon tracks and multiple sets of boots impressions documented by investigators indicate regular visitors to the remote property. Testimony from survivor Sarah Mitchell references the others, who sometimes came at night. Most disturbing is the evidence of regular deliveries leaving the Blackwood Ranch, destination unknown." Carson's implication was clear. Blackwood may have been supplying human remains to others in the territory. The paper speculated about a potential network of cannibals or some kind of depraved secret society operating in the region during that period. The paper also highlighted a disturbing pattern in the territorial records. Between 1879 and 1882, at least 7 men of substantial means and social standing in the territory died suddenly of digestive ailments or unknown stomach disorders. Medical knowledge of the time was insufficient to identify poisoning in many cases, raising the question of whether these deaths might be connected to the consumption of tainted meat supplied by Blackwood or his associates. One of the most shocking revelations in Carson's paper came from his discovery of a sealed appendix to the original investigation, a list of personal effects found at Blackwood's ranch that had been identified as belonging to known missing persons. The list included items belonging to 23 different individuals, suggesting a much higher victim count than had ever been publicly acknowledged. Carson also uncovered evidence that the territorial governor had personally intervened to limit the scope of the investigation. A telegram from the governor to the sheriff, dated April 2, 1882, instructed, "Confine inquiry to Blackwood himself. Broader investigation unnecessary and potentially damaging to territory's reputation. Existing evidence sufficient for prosecution." Within weeks of the paper's publication, Carson reported being pressured by university officials to discontinue his research. His requests for further access to the Blackwood files were denied. In a letter to a colleague dated April 1962, Carson wrote, "It appears I have disturbed a nest of snakes. Powerful interests seem determined to keep the full Blackwood story buried. I've been advised in no uncertain terms to pursue other research topics if I wish to maintain my position here." Carson complied, never publishing on the subject again. His original paper was not included in the university library's collection, and copies became increasingly difficult to find. The Blackwood case returned to obscurity, mentioned occasionally in books about frontier crime, but always with minimal details and emphasis on Blackwood's death ending the investigation. A former graduate student of Carson's, interviewed in 1979, claimed that Carson had compiled extensive notes for a book-length treatment of the Blackwood case, including connections to prominent territorial families. These notes allegedly disappeared from Carson's office shortly before his sudden retirement in 1963. Carson himself refused all interviews on the subject until his death in 1976. In 1968, a fire in the territorial archives reportedly destroyed many of the original Blackwood case documents. According to the official report, the fire was caused by faulty wiring. However, former archivist Maria Sanchez claimed in a 1979 interview with a local newspaper that she had seen men removing specific files from the archive room the day before the fire. Her claims were never investigated. What truth remained about Theodore Blackwood and his horrific activities was now scattered across fragmented records, local folklore, and carefully guarded secrets. The land where his ranch once stood remained abandoned, unmarked on modern maps, known locally only as the Bad Ground, a place to be avoided without explanation. For nearly a century, the full story of what happened at Blackwood's ranch in 1881 has been systematically obscured, buried by those who perhaps feared that some secrets are too disturbing to unearth. Yet fragments remain, pieces of a macabre puzzle that continue to disturb those who stumble upon them. In 1984, a graduate student named Jennifer Reyes, researching the history of land use in Lincoln County, discovered survey maps from 1882 that showed a property matching Blackwood's ranch location. Intrigued by the notation "condemned by territorial order," she began investigating. According to Reyes' unpublished thesis notes, found in the university archives, local residents still avoid the area. When questioned about the land, older residents become noticeably uncomfortable. One elderly man who requested anonymity told me his grandfather had warned him never to go near that valley, saying, "What happened there was against God and nature, and the ground remembers." Reyes attempted to visit the site but found the access road deliberately blocked by felled trees and boulders. When she inquired with the county office about property ownership, she was told the records for that particular parcel had been lost decades ago. Shortly afterward, her faculty advisors suggested she focus on a different area for her research. Reyes noted in her personal journal, "There seems to be an unspoken agreement among local officials and old families not to discuss the history of that valley." When I mentioned the name Blackwood to the county clerk, his demeanor changed instantly. He claimed to have never heard the name, but his eyes told a different story. This isn't mere historical obscurity, this is active suppression. Another researcher, anthropologist Dr. Mark Fontaine, encountered similar resistance when attempting to conduct a survey of abandoned settlements in the region in 1992. In a letter to a colleague, he wrote, "The most peculiar aspect of my fieldwork has been the reaction to my interest in the Northeastern Valley. Officials deny any settlement ever existed there, despite clear evidence on historical maps. Local ranchers refused to guide me to the area, claiming various improbable dangers. One elderly resident began to tell me about the cannibal rancher before being silenced by his son. There is a conspiracy of silence surrounding this place that defies rational explanation." That same year, construction workers expanding a highway near the old Blackwood property uncovered human remains. According to the county medical examiner's initial report, the bones showed signs of cutting consistent with butchering techniques. However, the official report later filed stated only that historical remains of undetermined origin had been discovered and reburied. A local newspaper reporter who attempted to investigate the discovery was informed by the county sheriff that the matter had been turned over to federal authorities due to the possibility of the remains being of Native American origin, protected under federal law. No follow-up was ever published. The most recent connection to the Blackwood case came in 2004, when historian Robert Martinez discovered a collection of personal letters in a Santa Fe estate sale. Among them was correspondence between two territorial officials dated May 1882 discussing the Blackwood case. One letter contained a disturbing passage. The decision to end B's life before trial was necessary. His claims of having distinguished clients who shared his proclivities threatened to implicate men whose reputations must remain unblemished for the territory's progress. Some secrets must remain buried for the greater good. Another letter in the collection made reference to a ledger allegedly kept by Blackwood, listing deliveries made to clients identified only by initials. The letter stated, "The ledger has been destroyed as agreed. No copy exists. The families mentioned therein can rest assured their privacy is preserved." Martinez attempted to authenticate the letters and continue his research, but reported that the documents disappeared from his office shortly after he had mentioned them to a colleague. No formal investigation into the theft was conducted. In an interview shortly before his death in 2016, Martinez reflected on his brief encounter with the Blackwood materials. "What troubled me most wasn't just the horror of what Blackwood did, it was the evidence that his activities were known and potentially facilitated by people in positions of power. The correspondence I found suggested that after his death, there was a coordinated effort, not just to bury the case, but to protect the identities of those who may have been complicit. This wasn't just covering up a crime, it was preserving a power structure." Martinez's claims echo those made by Dr. Carson decades earlier, that Blackwood's activities were not those of an isolated madman, but potentially connected to a darker aspect of territorial society that powerful interests have worked for generations to keep hidden. A journal found during the renovation of an old home in Santa Fe in 2010 added another disturbing piece to the puzzle. The journal, attributed to a territorial official named William Hawkins, contained an entry from May 1882 that read, "The Blackwood matter has been resolved to the satisfaction of all concerned parties. The governor assures me that all evidence regarding the special orders has been destroyed. Those who enjoyed B's particular services need fear no exposure. I remain troubled by the extent of this perversion among men I once considered honorable, but self-preservation dictates my silence." The journal was donated to the State Historical Society, but was subsequently reported missing from their collection in 2011. No investigation was conducted. Today, the remote valley where Theodore Blackwood once lured unsuspecting travelers to their deaths remains undeveloped. Modern maps show it as part of a wildlife conservation area, restricted to public access. Local hiking guides explicitly route travelers away from the area, citing unstable ground as the reason. The questions remain. How many victims fell prey to Blackwood's horrific appetites? Was he truly working alone, or was he part of a larger network that managed to escape justice? Why have authorities across generations seemed determined to keep the full story buried? Perhaps some historical horrors are better left unexplored, or perhaps, as Dr. Carson suggested in his final note on the subject, the Blackwood case reveals not just the depravity of one man, but the darker appetites that may lurk beneath the veneer of civilization. It is a mirror society dares not look into too deeply, for fear of what it might recognize in its own reflection. The land where Blackwood's ranch once stood has remained undisturbed for generations. Local residents still avoid the area, though few could explain exactly why. It has become part of the landscape's unspoken history, a place marked not by monuments or plaques, but by absence and silence. In 2016, a hiking group veered off their planned route and inadvertently entered the valley where Blackwood's property had stood. Their subsequent account, posted on an online hiking forum, described an unsettling experience. The temperature seemed to drop as we entered the narrow valley. No birds singing, no insects buzzing, just an oppressive silence. We found old stone foundations partially reclaimed by the earth. Our guide became visibly distressed when he realized where we were, insisting we leave immediately. He refused to explain why, only saying some places should be left alone. That night at camp, several of us reported the same nightmare. A figure watching us from a doorway, holding what looked like a ladle, beckoning us inside. The post was removed within days. One member of that hiking group, a graduate student named Daniel Foster, became intrigued by their experience and began researching the history of the valley. In an unpublished manuscript found among his possessions after his disappearance in 2018, Foster wrote, "The more I dig into what happened in that valley, the more resistance I encounter. Local historians change the subject. Archive requests are denied or files reported missing. Even my academic advisor warned me to find a less problematic research topic. What happened there that remained so dangerous to explore even 136 years later?" Foster was last seen heading toward the restricted area with camping equipment and recording devices. His car was found abandoned at a trailhead 5 miles from the valley. Despite an extensive search, no trace of him was ever found. Park rangers and wildlife officials deny any unusual activity or reports associated with the area, maintaining that it is simply protected land with sensitive ecological features. Yet they offer no explanation for why the region remains unmarked on public maps and absent from tourist guides. A ranger who requested anonymity told a local reporter in 2019, "We're instructed not to discuss that particular valley with the public." Official policy is to discourage access due to unstable ground conditions, but I've never seen any geological survey supporting that claim. Some of the older rangers won't go near it, even during emergency operations. There's an unwritten rule here. We don't talk about what's out there, and we certainly don't go there after dark. The story of Theodore Blackwood and his victims has become a whispered legend, a tale told around campfires with details distorted by time and retelling. But beneath the folklore lies a documented history of real horror, fragments of truth preserved in scattered records, survivor testimonies, and the conspicuous silences in official histories. What happened at that remote ranch in 1881 represents more than just the crimes of one deranged individual. It speaks to the vulnerability of travelers in the vast, untamed spaces of the American frontier. It reveals how isolation could conceal the darkest human impulses, allowing predators to operate beyond the reach of law or community oversight. And perhaps most disturbingly, it suggests that Blackwood's appetites, though extreme, may not have been entirely unique, that others in positions of power may have shared or at least protected such depravity. The territorial authorities of 1882 chose to burn Blackwood's ranch to the ground, to fill his cellar with stones, to seal the records of his crimes, perhaps hoping that fire and time would erase all memory of what had occurred there. In many ways, they succeeded. The full accounting of Blackwood's victims, the true extent of his operations, and the identities of any potential accomplices remain unknown. In 2020, a cache of letters was discovered during the renovation of an old law office in Santa Fe. Among them was correspondence between a territorial judge and a prominent businessman dated June 1882. One letter contained a passage that reads, "The Blackwood affair must remain buried, not merely for the reputation of the territory, but for the sanity of its citizens. Some evils are too grotesque to be contemplated by civilized minds. If the full truth of his operation and his clientele were to become known, the very fabric of our society might unravel. Better that one man's madness be forgotten than for the public to discover the appetites that exist among those they trust to lead." These hints of wider complicity in Blackwood's crimes, of distinguished clients and special orders, suggest a darker narrative than the official account of a lone madman preying on travelers. They raise the disturbing possibility that Blackwood was not merely a predator, but a provider, supplying the products of his depravity to others whose positions protected them from suspicion or scrutiny. Dr. Elizabeth Harmon, a forensic psychologist who studied the fragmented records of the case in 2021, offered this analysis. The pattern of evidence suppression spanning generations suggests more than just a desire to forget a disturbing chapter in local history. The question is not just what Blackwood did, but who benefited from or participated in his activities, and who continues to benefit from keeping those connections hidden. Yet something of those events persists in the continued avoidance of that valley by locals who cannot articulate why, in the reluctance of authorities to discuss the area's history, and in the scattered documents that occasionally resurface, offering brief glimpses into a horror that some have worked diligently to keep buried. This level of coordinated concealment typically indicates the protection of individuals or institutions whose exposure would threaten existing power structures. In the end, perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the Blackwood case is not what we know, but what remains hidden, the possibility that the full truth is still being concealed not by the passage of time, but by deliberate choice. As historian Martinez noted in his final interview before abandoning his research, history is not just what we remember, it's also what we choose to forget, and sometimes those choices reveal more about us than the events themselves. The valley where Theodore Blackwood once lured travelers to their deaths is quiet now. The winds that sweep through the narrow passage carry no screams, no whispers of the horrors that unfolded there. The ground has reclaimed the ashes of his burned-out ranch, covering the evidence of his depravity with new growth. Nature, indifferent to human suffering, has erased nearly all physical traces of what occurred in that remote corner of the New Mexico territory. But in archives and memories, in nightmares and whispered warnings, the story endures, a reminder of the darkness that once found harbor in those hills, and perhaps a warning that such darkness never truly disappears. It merely waits, patient and hungry, for the right conditions to emerge once more. In 2022, a hiker reported finding a rusted metal container half buried in a wash about 3 miles from the former Blackwood property. Inside was a leather-bound journal, its pages mostly degraded beyond legibility. The few readable passages appeared to be written in Blackwood's hand, based on comparison with known samples of his writing from territorial records. One partially preserved page contained this disturbing fragment. "They come to me willingly, seeking shelter from the harshness of this land. never suspecting they offer themselves up as sacrifice. The irony delights me. Those who appreciate the particular flavor of my hospitality are welcome to partake, for a price. The hunger that drives them to my table is no different from the hunger that drives me to prepare it. Only the object differs. We are all consumers in the end. The journal was submitted to the State Historical Society for preservation and study. It was reported lost in transit. The hiker who found it stopped granting interviews after claiming to experience disturbing dreams, featuring a tall, gaunt man offering him a bowl of steaming stew. For those travelers who stopped at Blackwood's Ranch in 1881, the promise of shelter became a fatal trap. For us, over a century later, their story serves as a grim reminder of our vulnerability and the thin veneer that separates civilization from savagery. We may never know all their names or the full extent of their suffering, but in remembering what fragments of their story remain, we ensure that they did not disappear entirely without witness. A local legend persists among the oldest families in Lincoln County that on certain nights, when the wind blows from the east, the scent of cooking meat can be detected coming from the valley where Blackwood's Ranch once stood. Those who have encountered this phenomenon describe a sudden, overwhelming hunger followed by an equally powerful revulsion, as if the body and mind are at war over whether to approach or flee. Psychological researchers suggest this is merely the power of suggestion acting on people familiar with the Blackwood story. Yet local ranchers still ensure their cattle never graze near that valley, and hunting guides warn their clients away from the area, claiming the game there has a strange taste that sits wrong in the belly. In 2023, a team from a paranormal investigation television show attempted to film at the site of Blackwood's Ranch. They received all necessary permits from wildlife officials who seemed unusually eager to debunk the myths surrounding the area. The footage they captured showed nothing unusual, just an empty valley with a few stone foundations partially visible among the vegetation. However, when they returned to their production facility and reviewed the audio recordings, they discovered something their equipment had captured that their ears had not, beneath the natural sounds of wind and distant wildlife, barely audible but unmistakable, once isolated, the rhythmic sound of a knife on a cutting board and what seemed to be a man humming tunelessly as he worked. The episode never aired. The production company cited technical issues with the footage as the reason. A sound engineer who worked on the project later claimed on an anonymous forum that the entire team had been required to sign unusually restrictive non-disclosure agreements after the discovery of the audio anomalies. The territory has long since become a state, the frontier has been tamed, and the isolated valleys have been mapped and claimed. But some places remain marked by their history, resonating with echoes of past horrors that never fully fade. The valley where Blackwood's Ranch once stood is such a place, a wound in the landscape that never quite healed, a story never fully told. And perhaps that is as it should be. Some truths are too disturbing to be fully unearthed, some appetites too horrifying to be closely examined. The partial burial of Blackwood's story may be not just an act of historical erasure, but a form of collective self-preservation, a tacit acknowledgement that there are depths to human depravity that we dare not face directly. As you drive through the New Mexico landscape today, passing remote ranches and isolated homesteads, consider how the vast spaces that once concealed Blackwood's activities have been diminished but not eliminated. The frontier may be gone, but isolation remains possible. The conditions that allowed a predator to operate undetected for so long have changed, but not disappeared entirely. In 2024, an elderly woman living in a nursing home in Albuquerque claimed to be the great-granddaughter of Sarah Mitchell, one of Blackwood's surviving victims. In an interview with a local historian, she shared a story passed down through generations. My great-grandmother told my grandmother, who told my mother, who told me, that the worst part wasn't what Blackwood did to her. It was learning what he had already done to her, what he had fed her during those first days at his ranch, before she became suspicious and stopped eating his food. She said that knowledge was a poison that never left her system. Some days she would look at her own hands and wonder if they had become contaminated by what they had unknowingly touched and consumed. The woman also claimed that Sarah Mitchell had taken one secret to her grave: the identities of the visitors who sometimes came to Blackwood's ranch at night. She would never speak their names, even within the family. She said some of them had descendants who still held power in the state, and that naming them would only bring danger. But she made us promise never to trust certain families, never to be alone with them. That promise has been kept through 4 generations. Whether this account is authentic or merely another layer of folklore surrounding the Blackwood case cannot be determined. The nursing home resident died in her sleep the week after giving the interview. The historian's recording of their conversation was corrupted by unexplained electronic interference, rendering most of it unintelligible. The sound of the wind through the valleys of Lincoln County might, if you listen closely, still carry echoes of those who entered Blackwood's ranch as guests and became something else entirely, victims of a hunger that transcended normal human appetite, players in a macabre drama that the authorities of the time decided was better left unfinished, unknown, and unremembered. Some say that on cold nights, when the wind blows from the east, the smell of smoke still rises from that valley, not the comforting smoke of a hearth fire, but something sharper, more disturbing, a reminder that some flames never truly die out, and some hungers are never fully satisfied. In the words of Dr. Carson, whose attempts to uncover the full truth ended in forced silence. The horror of Blackwood's ranch lies not just in what one man did there, but in what it reveals about human nature. That beneath our civilized veneer lurks the capacity for unspeakable cruelty, and that this capacity may be closer to the surface than we care to admit. Perhaps those who worked so diligently to bury this story understood that some mirrors reflect truths too disturbing to face. Truths about not just one man's madness, but about the darkness that may reside in us all. The valley remains, silent and empty. The ground has long since absorbed the blood spilled there. The wind has carried away the screams. But the story persists, passed down through generations in whispers and warnings, a reminder that even in the vast openness of the American frontier, there were shadows deep enough to conceal unimaginable horrors. And perhaps somewhere in dusty archives or forgotten attics, in letters never meant to be read or journals hidden away, the full truth still waits, patient as the land itself, for someone brave or foolish enough to unearth it. The question remains, are some histories better left buried?